All right, welcome back again, grade 9s. We're going to continue our look at chapter 3 now by looking a little more deeply into human rights. And I want to begin by just introducing this concept as something for you to think about, for you to internalize, not only this year, but in grade 10 and grade 12, that the evolution of the human rights movement clearly illustrates humanity's ongoing struggle towards creating a better world. And this is a quote that I created. There should be quotation marks at both ends, but I created it nearly a decade ago now, and even looking at the recent events in the summer of 2020 and all the protests in the streets, you can see the continued relevance of this struggle and the continued struggle to find and create a better world for our future. So that's just something to internalize, to keep thinking about, and then we dove into a 9-minute video on what are human rights. And I know you got lots of great answers to share with me. What's one way to define human rights? What do you remember? Human rights are? Yes? Yeah, that was at the end of the video, right? So at the end of the video, and I saw you writing that down, and I thought, oh man, they're defining it again. So at the end of the video, they said human rights are about the choices we make every day. So I might make a choice today that could take away your human right. Maybe we're outside and you're enjoying it and you're like, woo, it's a beautiful day, let's play. And I'm like, oh, you don't get to play. So there's a choice I'm making as an authority figure in your life that I could be taking away that parcel of time that human right, straight out of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, right, number 34, the right to play. And by taking it away, I'm redefining what human rights are. So one way to define human rights, it's about the choices we make as we connect with others, as we relate to others. So if you relate to people with kindness, then we're growing human rights, we're expanding them. If you relate to others with exploitation, then really what we're doing is we're taking human rights away. So that is one way to define it for sure. Any other definitions of human rights that you remember from the 9-minute video we just watched? Yes?
Human rights are the rights of human.
Yeah, so human rights are the rights that we're entitled to simply because we're human. So rights themselves are things that you're entitled to, right? So human rights are those things that we're entitled to because we are human. So because we're human, we qualify for them. That's it. We don't have to have a certain economic status, a certain political ideology, a certain social status, or even a certain nationality. Human rights are meant to be universal. You're human, you get these. The concept of human rights does go back to pre-Neolithic time. So in the Social 10 curriculum, when we study globalization next year, we're going to be talking about the Neolithic Revolution. And before the Neolithic time, man lived closer to nature. And in nature, we have certain rights. So one of the things that the Greeks and Romans wrestled with was the idea of what was natural. What rights would we have in a state of nature? And some of them that many people agree would be like the freedom of movement. That would be an example that in nature, you'd have the freedom of movement. But the reality is that we don't live in nature anymore. We've created societies, we've created governments. Government is a human-made invention, right? So why do we have government and how does it affect our lives? And we can see through a series of legislations created by governments. So these are often seen as landmark moments in the evolution of human rights. And there's one that kind of got us started in the ancient time period that many people overlook. So which one was that? Do you remember? Thought I saw your hand up. Nope. That's it. Nope. Yes. Cyrus the Great. So I believe it was at the British Museum of History where they had Cyrus's cylinder. And when we went there in 2015, we saw it, and it was quite amazing. There's people lined up to look at it. But Cyrus Cylinder was this idea that, he made these proclamations. But one of the proclamations that Cyrus the Great made was that after he conquered an area, the people of that area now were free to religiously worship anyone of their choosing. So he would introduce them to his God and say, you know what, this is my God. My God's pretty cool. It'd be neat if you worship my God, but you don't have to. And that was uncommon. Typically when someone was conquered by someone else, there would be this assimilation that would happen, right? And those that would resist would be killed. Because the point of conquering others would be to expand your culture, and your religion's a part of that. But Cyrus the Great was very progressive, very liberal, very idealist, right? Ahead of his time. And he said, you know what? You can be free. So one of the milestones in the evolution of human rights is Cyrus the Great allowing freedom to those he conquered. So he destroys their government, he destroys their empire that they lived under. Many of them were living under empires they hadn't chose to live under, by the way. But then once he destroyed that government, he said, now that I am your government, now that I'm governing you, you are free to worship who you wish. And for them, religion was the most important right. So this was an amazing gift that he was giving them. So then they talked about the Greeks, and they talked about the Romans wrestling around, what is a right, and are rights natural. And then the video gets up to 1215 in the Magna Carta. Doesn't give you much background, but some of the background, which is alluded to at the end of one of the more recent tellings of the Robin Hood story, is that the King of England had been practicing a system where he would take a child from each of the lesser nobles. So if you were a noble of England, then he would take one of your children and they would live with him as a ward. And therefore, if you rose up against the king, if you challenged the king's authority, he would have your child tortured. And the English are really good at coming up with creative ways of torturing, but one of the main ones was quartering someone. You hooked them up to 4 horses, and the 4 horses ride in 4 different directions. So this leg gets pulled off in that direction, this leg gets pulled off in that direction, this arm and part of my trunk gets pulled in that way, and I go that way too. So just tear somebody apart. That's torturous. But he'd be able to do that because he had hostage one of your children. And he may even force some of your family to watch. So the lesser nobles of England were unhappy with the amount of authority the king had, that they saw the king as a threat. The king felt that it was the divine right, that because they were chosen by birth to be king, that's how you become king, is you're born into it, then God must be God's will that you're able to rule. So you have this conflict between the divine right of absolute monarchs and the idea that no, even kings don't have absolute power. And the Magna Carta of 1215 is one of those landmark documents that restricts the power of the king. It says, you know what, you can't do just anything. Taking our kids hostage, holding them as wards of the state, torturing them if we question your policies, this is unacceptable. So there was a rebellion that led to the king being forced to sign the Magna Carta. Now, for the record, after the king signed it, the king kind of ruled like he forgot he signed it, but we look back to the Magna Carta as a landmark document that says, this is why in Canada the queen can't do anything she wants. We have a constitutional monarchy in Canada because of the Magna Carta. It sets a precedent, a quid pro quo, a legal precedent that says because of this, you can't do anything you wish. Then we get into I think they talk about the British Civil War of the 17th century and then the French Revolution of the 18th century. So in grade 11, you're going to study the French Revolution of 1789. And they talk about how the French describe rights now as natural. They take the ideas of natural law from Rome and make them into the natural rights. And in 1789, the French have the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen that, much like the Magna Carta, limits the powers of the monarchy. But then there's a but, right? And the video is like a but. Because as we have seen, it is an ongoing struggle. Sometimes when you struggle, there's times where there's a lapse and you regress, and there's a but. And the but is that the video is very, very anti-authoritarianism because it's pro-human rights. The video suggests that Napoleon comes into power as a new authoritarian leader, as an emperor, not a king, but an emperor, and ends up taking away many of the rights that are declared in the 1789 Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. There's the but. There's other buts in the video. Then they're like, and then the Europeans go and try to conquer much of the known world, right? There's a scramble for Africa, you'll see in grade 10. They go to India and they take over India. But then there's a glimmer of hope. Even while people are out there trying to take rights away from others, there's other people like Mahatma Gandhi that say that's unacceptable. So Mahatma Gandhi practices civil disobedience, questions the power of the British to control the Indian subcontinent, and ultimately the British Empire leaves India. And we'll study Gandhi in grade 10. So we have this continued struggle, and there's times of progression, but there's also times of regression. But what we see are a number of key characters in history, the Mahatma Gandhis, the Martin Luther King Jr.'s, that continue to push for a redefining more human rights. And social justice is, the defining topic of 2020 other than the pandemic, and social justice is human rights. A social expression of human rights. How do we relate to each other as individuals? Do we allow things like race to create prejudice? The video suggests that in 1948, the UN declared a list of essential human rights, but then there's a but, right? And the but is that to many, these are simply just words on a page. That the third right listed is the right to life, but there are many countries that still have the death penalty. The United States, some of the states in the US still have the death penalty. And some countries like Saudi Arabia or Iran, they still have public execution. So even though countries signed the document and said, yeah, this is a good document, and sign it right there, they've gone and ignored the rights that are listed there. So the problem is that although we have a document, we have no way to enforce the document. What do we do as an international community when countries violate the human rights that they have declared they will protect? So that's a topic to think about too. Lots of long-term thinking being introduced today. They talk about things like slavery in this video, and the idea that transatlantic slave trade, again, you'll see that in grade 10. My grade 10s are learning about that today. The transatlantic slave trade, many people think of that as the height of slavery, or the lowest depth, if you want to put an emotion on it. But the reality, the video says, is there's more people in slavery today than ever before. So in 1948, we declared slavery is bad. But in 2020, you and I make choices, and this is your definition of human rights, right? The choices we make. There's choices we make that make others into our slaves. So what kind of shoes am I going to wear? Where were they made? Under what conditions were those workers working? Were they working in slave-like conditions? To support my standard of living, my quality of life, how many people live in servitude? Now, they're not slaves that live at my house, but they're slaves that are put into positions of servitude within our global economy to support my choices. So that's what the video is getting at the end, is the idea that as active citizens, we need to be more aware of the consequences or the externality, the consequences even unintended of our choices. So where are we headed with this? Well, next up, in the next part of this, we're going to look at the Bill of Rights of the United States. We're going to look at the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, so we have 2 videos for that. And then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about under what conditions should we limit these things. I'm not going to record the recordings of us watching the videos about the Bill of Rights and the Charter, but there's links in the lesson. But after you look at the links, we'll continue with this Prezi, and we're going to look at the language of the Charter and say, okay, under what conditions should we limit things? So we'll stop the introduction to human rights there, and now we're going to go and look at the Bill of Rights as just a quick preloading for grade 12, and then we'll look at the Charter in greater detail.